when we look at the kingdom Animalia, a very discrete taxonomic unit of living things on our planet, the kingdom Animalia, we see about 35 different kinds of animals, and each one of those is a phylum. And if you take invertebrate zoology, or you've taken invertebrate zoology, we'll talk about each of these, but we're focusing on one group of one phylum in this class, the vertebrates. So we wanted to define animal in an inclusive sense before we move on. What is it to be an animal? And what we mean by that, there's a couple ways you can approach that. You can descriptive, well, animals do this, animals do that. That's one way to try to define animals. Another way is the way that someone like me does it, an evolutionary biologist, and we define a group of organisms as an evolutionary lineage. And we refer to that as a group, or a natural group is a group, these are all animals up here, a group that has a common ancestor and all the descendants of that ancestor. That's a natural group. That's the word we use for it. We'll talk about that more later, but it's one complete evolutionary radiation. We're not adding anything from other evolutionary radiations, and we're not excluding anything. It's one family, one cohesive group. And that's what we mean by the animal kingdom in this context, what I mean by it. So when we look at animals, we can look at the most simplest animals we still have with us are sponges. And animals can be incredibly simple compared to something like a really complex animal, like a vertebrate, which is where we are today. So we run this gamut from very simple and very primitive to us, which we like to think we're pretty sophisticated creatures. So we can describe the animal kingdom. This is more describing. These are things that are characteristic of most or many of these animal groups. And again, there's our animal friends there. These are descriptive terms. This is a set of slides I have in almost every one of my zoology classes. Animals are heterotrophic, and there's a chance to reacquaint ourselves with that word. Remember, that means that you have to eat. Trophic means food. Hetero means different. You have to eat. In other words, you're not a plant. You're not photosynthetic. And all animals are heterotrophic. There are no photosynthetic animals. All animals are multicellular. Sometimes I slip in lab, and when we're looking at like amoebas and parameciums, little single-celled creatures, I say it's single-celled animals. They're not animals. All animals are multicellular. This is the thing that early biologists made a big deal of, because they were looking for a very distinct difference between plants and animals. And as animals, we don't have cell walls. I need a piece of wood here. Plants have cell walls, and their cells are in little boxes. Ours are not. Animals move. It's not unique to us. An amoeba moves around. He's not an animal, but it's one of our descriptive features. We can move around. And again, this isn't unique to us, but we're kind of chauvinistic. We like to think we're the end-all of evolution. And we're very diverse in forms. Lots of different kinds of animals. Also lots of different kinds of bacteria if you know how to look at them. And we've gotten ourselves into all sorts of habitats and niches. If you look across the planet, there are relatively few habitat types that support life that don't have an animal in them. There's a few places where we only have things like bacteria, but for the most part, animals have gotten themselves in all sorts of places. Lots of different ways to be an animal. That's niche. Animals reproduce sexually, at least some of the time, most of us. We'll talk about that in another context later, but sexual reproduction is widespread in the animal kingdom. That's two rattlesnakes getting to know each other, in case you haven't figured that out. That's what it looks like. Most animals have unique tissues that we don't see anywhere else in the living thing. And tissue is a group of cells that does something like skin tissue or liver tissue. And animals have two unique tissues. They're both in this slide here. This big pink thing is a muscle fiber. And this little strand here is a nerve cell. We have nervous tissue, we have muscle tissue. At least most animals do. Then a big deal, and this gets to actually defining us evolutionarily, animals have a unique developmental pathway. And remember, because I'm going to start using it this way, the word development is the word that biologists use when they're talking about something. The word might be more familiar to you as embryology. But biologists tend to use the word development, so I'm going to stop using I'm not going to use the word embryology again, but our development is unique.
So these are descriptive terms, but not necessarily that thing we're looking for, that character that defines the kingdom. And the way we look at that is we look for what is absolutely unique about animals. What do all of us share that defines us? And what we mean by that, I'm going to need this layer, go back to here. What we're looking for is the characters that evolved here. The ancestor of the animal kingdom invented something new and cool, maybe a bunch of things, and they're unique animal things, and all the descendants show them. So what are the traits we look for in animals that define us? What shows up in our ancestor that defines us? So there are a handful of things that we hypothesize come from that ancestor. And I touched upon a couple of them already, but here's one of them here. Animals have a unique form of embryology. See, I used that word again, I said I wouldn't. We have a unique development, and we all start life as what's called a blastulate embryo. And here's a blastula right here. It's a hollow ball of cells. Picture a tennis ball. Hollow ball of cells. That's unique to us. So we hypothesize, again, the ancestor invented that. Within the body of an animal, a multicellular animal, the cells communicate with each other. Even in very simple animals, the cells recognize each other. You're part of me. And we call it cell-to-cell signaling, and that's one of our unique features. Your liver cells are talking to your nervous cells and things like that. Even something simple like a sponge, the different cells are communicating with each other. And finally, our ancestor invented tissue types, cell types. We have different types of cells. You have a bunch of them. You have liver cells, skin cells, nervous cells. But even a very simple animal like a sponge has differentiated cell types. And so again, these are things that we hypothesize show up in the ancestor. They were developed or evolved initially down here. We'll talk about a real quick review of evolution in a few minutes. There's another 6 or 7 we could point to, but these are 3 they're kind of obvious ones we'll focus on. And again, we hypothesize these were in the ancestor because as we look across the diversity of all living animals, we see all these things. So we think they appear way down here. So there's an evolutionary tree of the animal kingdom with all the different phyla. There's just like a dozen or so phyla. There they all are. And from that common ancestor, we get about 35 different kinds of animals. And the ranking there is the phylum level. 35 different phyla of animals. Phyla is plural, phylum singular. And we're not worried about 34 of those in this class. We leave them to the invertebrate class. But that's the diversity. So, let's leave most of those behind. We want to focus on the vertebrates. The vertebrata, and I don't know where we're at today. At one point we're going to define the vertebrate. So, what is a vertebrate? Got 2 kinds of animals in a very loose definition, using very loose definitions. There's vertebrates and invertebrates. Now, vertebrates are subject to this class, and we're going to define them rigorously in a little bit, but a vertebrate, that's a taxonomic category. That's a natural group. There's an ancestor to the vertebrate animals, and off that ancestor comes everything we consider to be a vertebrate. Go back to that concept of natural group. The vertebrates are natural. Invertebrate, that is just a group, not a group, it's just a term of convenience. An invertebrate is everything that's not a vertebrate. So we don't define things on negatives. So that's a natural group, that's just everybody else. It's kind of like saying, I'm an American and everybody else is a foreigner. Foreigner's not a category, right? American is, Britain is, Mexican is, foreigner is just everybody else. And when we look at our evolutionary tree here, there's the kingdom Animalia, and there's a phylum, we're going to have to find this phylum a little bit as well, but there's a phylum called the Chordata. And vertebrates are one part of that phylum. We're not even a phylum, we're a subphylum. So that's the focus of this semester here. And everybody else is an invertebrate, including some chordate animals.
So there's the taxonomy at the big picture level, how we normally rank it. Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata, which is the subject of this class here. We have to play a little bit with these higher things just to get started. So let's define the vertebrates. We'll do that in more detail later. This is kind of our introduction here. These are whales. When I say we want to define a group, what I say is, what I mean is, what's the ancestor? What was happening here? What did that ancestor come up with? What new features evolved here that define everything that comes later? And the most obvious thing, and we'll talk about this, but the most obvious thing is a backbone. And the group name Vertebrata is talking about having a vertebral column, a backbone. There's another really key trait here in vertebrates, and different textbooks present this in slightly different ways. I'm going to present it in my way. But there's also, early on, a cranium appeared. It says your cranium. We don't mean head. A grasshopper has a head, but it doesn't have a cranium. A cranium is a box in which we put our brain. It can be made of cartilage, it can be made of bone. And when we look at this group we call vertebrates, these two traits show about the same time. And some textbooks will talk about craniates, with vertebrates being most of the craniates. Some groups will just talk about the vertebrates, and that'll be an equal sign to craniates. I'll tease them apart a little bit, but I don't want to focus on that. We're going to call them vertebrates in this class. But when you see the word craniata, that's just almost a direct equal sign to vertebrata. There's just one small difference the way the two are used. And I don't want to focus. I think your textbook has it that way. I don't want to focus on this class. But we'll get there when we talk about early craniates and early vertebrates. So who are the vertebrates? This is just the diversity thing. Let's just throw some groups up there. Who are we talking about? In kind of traditional sense, and in any elementary school science class, these are the things you talk about. Fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. These are the vertebrates, and they're animals that are very familiar to you. And, you're one of them. You're in one of these groups here. Those are not necessarily all natural groups anymore. In other words, they're not one ancestor to, for example, what we call reptiles, and all the descendants off that ancestor are in the traditional thing we call reptiles. We have to tease things apart a little bit. Fishes, it turns out, well, there's a bunch of different things called fishes. 5 or 6 different groups called fishes. Fishes is not a natural group. Amphibians is. Ancestor thing we call amphibians, and it's got the whole radiation. Reptiles and birds are really the same thing. Birds are a type of reptile, maybe another way to put that. And then mammals, yeah, if you look at the living ones, it's pretty clear. But if we look at some of the fossil stuff, it becomes a little less clear. So we want to start teasing these different things apart. So one way to get around the big problem here is with reptiles, birds, and mammals, is we'll just call the reptiles and birds diapsids. That's a word that includes birds and the things we traditionally call reptiles. We just call them diapsids. And we'll talk about what that word means later. And with regard to mammals and things that are in the fossil record that really aren't mammals but are in the ancestry of mammals, we'll call them synapsids, and we'll define that word later as well. By the way, if you see quotes around a category, that means it's not natural. It means it's not one ancestor and a full set of lineages. So, and when we put a dagger by something or a cross, that means it's only known from the fossil record. And here are some things from the fossil record that really don't fall into any of these groups very cleanly. So we've got all sorts of cool extinct stuff that often serves as transitional from one group to the next, but really, as these groups are defined, don't fit cleanly into them. And we'll touch upon some of these things as we go along, because they're really, really cool. All right, where are we here? Did that. that. So if we look at vertebrates, and we're going to walk through the ancestry of these different groups because I think it's interesting. But when we get to how things work, the biology, the physiology, the function, the ecology, we tend to focus on the living things. They're the ones that are most familiar to us. And we have just a wonderful array of vertebrates on our planet today. Maybe 80, 90,000 species of vertebrates today. Most of them are fishes. And then there's the fossil stuff. And there's a lot of fossil stuff in some of these groups we're going to talk about. And then, like I said, some things that really don't fall into anything that we would recognize today. I often point out the basic chauvinism. Chauvinism means, it's a kind of a more polite word for bigotry. It means you value your own group over others. Right? It comes from one of Napoleon's generals named Chauvenet or something like that, and he was a raging bigot. So we get that word. Chauvinism means I'm better than you are. And I just think it's probably a little bit polite, more polite word than bigot. But as humans were chauvinists, as animals were chauvinists, as vertebrates were chauvinists. And if you look at the slice of the animal kingdom here, vertebrates are a very small slice of the animal kingdom, and they're more than half of that textbook. And as I often point out, when you get a biology textbook, the closer you get to humans, the thicker the chapters get. And that's just our innate chauvinism. And it's okay, just as long as we recognize it. 99% of the animal kingdom is not vertebrates. So that's another thing. We're just focusing on vertebrates here. Fishes are about half of the subphylum Vertebrata. And we have amphibians here, traditional reptiles here, birds here, mammals there. This was kind of cool. I like this one, except they got it reversed. Other than that, I thought it was really colorful. This should be amphibians, that should be reptiles. So if you look at the animal kingdom as a whole, just one more look at the whole kingdom, just to get ourselves rooted. These are, again, every phylum is represented here by one picture, so it's about 35 there. These are the phyla that are only found in marine water. And we're going to talk about living in water. I think we'll get to that today. Life evolved in oceans, and oceans is the easiest place. The easiest place for things to live is in seawater. We don't think that because our ancestors came up on land. But all sorts of issues of physiology, that seawater is the easiest thing to live in. And these are phyla that are only found in marine systems, about a third of them. Another 9 or 10 get into freshwater. Freshwater is pretty challenging. And to live in freshwater for a thing that evolved in seawater, there's some adaptations that are needed there. But these are things that have made it into freshwater and have representatives still in marine habitats. Again, each picture represents a phylum. The toughest type of living is terrestrial living. And only 4 or 5 phyla have gotten up on land. And these are 4 that have truly terrestrial representatives. And there's 3 or 4 other phyla that you have a few things that are barely up on the land. There's some terrestrial flatworms, but they're really living in puddles more than on land. And then there's some freaks out there. There's a representative of a phylum that's only known from one species, and he's found in a freshwater spring in Greenland. So all his members are freshwater. And this is a bizarre little set of tropical worms that are terrestrial only phylum there. So there's always some weirdos. That's what makes biology fun. And there's a handful that are exclusively parasitic. That's living inside something else. So there's the whole animal kingdom. And if we take away the ones you don't see in an ocean, there you go. Doesn't change much. Zoology is best studied near an ocean, I've always thought. It's coming from someone who didn't see an ocean until he was 12 years old. So I grew up in deserts and mountains. So anyway, let's look at the vertebrates. The vertebrates span those habitat types. We're part of one of those groups that does really well in marine systems. We've got tremendous freshwater penetration, and we're the most visible group of terrestrial animals, certainly. And then it's worth pointing out that some terrestrial vertebrates have moved back into the water. Things we call fishes Well, their ancestors never came out of water, so they're still there. But marine mammals, for example, their ancestors evolved to live on land, they diversified on land, and then they went back into water. So there's the pie chart. Vertebrates represent a very small section of the animal kingdom, and we devote a whole course to this little piece of the pie here, and another whole course to this piece of the pie here. It's just our innate chauvinism. In fact, we devote several courses. At this university, we have 3 courses that just focus on vertebrates, and only 2 that I can think of that focus on invertebrates. And if this were a bigger, more established university, we would have several more vertebrate courses that we don't have here at this point. Herpetology and mammalogy is obvious. It's mammals. Herpetology is amphibians and reptiles. And anatomy. Almost, that would be an evolutionary course, comparative vertebrate anatomy. So